Hi again then guys, and welcome to our very first Rivals match for an older Gran Turismo game, Gran Turismo 2 in particular, and what better way to kick off a Gran Turismo 2 Rivals series, potentially, than to feature two of the exclusive cars to that game. The two unsung heroes, if you will, of the LM car class, which would be pretty cool to see return, but the likelihood of that is almost non-existent, to be fair. The Vector versus Venturi, the 600 LM versus the M12 LM. Both cars which I really love, both in road and race form. So of course the question is, which one, at least for the fun of it, using a combination of lap times and on-paper numbers, is the best in a general sense? Well, as always, we'll break down either car on its own, first of all, in a mini review, and then we'll put them head-to-head in a very Top Trumps-esque numbers breakdown to find out which one is better. First up then we have the Venturi 600 LM. Now I've mentioned before that this is not my favourite Venturi in the game. My favourite is the 400 GT, which is kind of the road-going version of this car. This vehicle is very lightweight, it weighs only 960 kilos, it's also extremely powerful with over 700 horsepower, and even though it does cost 2 million credits, which is the same price as the Vector and the Espace F1 and a few others, but I would still say that this 600 LM is definitely a race car standout from Gran Turismo 2. It's one of the cars which I would recommend to anyone to check out in the game. All three of the Venturis are very good, in a similar way to how all three of the Vectors are very interesting cars also, but this one is definitely the standout from a performance point of view, just like the M12 is for Vector. In terms of how this vehicle performs, well, in a straight line it's very strong, as you'd assume from a car with a whole lot of power and torque in a very lightweight frame and chassis, but the handling isn't, let's say, totally beginner friendly. You probably wouldn't assume that it would be anyway. It's a little bit slippery, and part of that is due to the fact that it is very, very lightweight. 960 kilos in a mid-engine rear-wheel drive GT car could always be challenging, regardless of what company or country the car comes from and the engineering behind it. But in the case of a company like Venturi, they don't have the massive resources and massive development teams and behind-the-scenes teams that other manufacturers would. Teams like Mercedes, Jaguar, various others. And sometimes, with a smaller team, you can see that. They don't perform as well. And although in real life the Venturi wasn't necessarily an all-conquering machine, in the game it can be a very strong competitor. Again, I'm not going to call it the best in class. That would be a very harsh and brash statement to make. But it is a very fast GT car and not necessarily an obvious choice of one. This does tend to be one of the GT or LM cars that can easily be forgotten, especially considering that it's in the same kind of dealership section as stuff like Peugeot, Citroën, Renault, because of course it is a French car, and as such people don't generally tend to go to that region much. You tend to go to, say, Germany, for instance, or America or Japan. Not so much France in that regard, but this car does go to show that France has at least a strong single offering in the case of this car. But then that begs the question, what about the Vector, America's ultra-rare, super obscure LM car? Well, even though both of these cars are simply referred to as LM vehicles in the world of Gran Turismo 2, they are actually both very similar to real-life racing versions. These are not fictional machines as far as I'm aware. I believe there is a real-world version of both of them. Not necessarily exactly the same in terms of all of their specs or even all of the visuals, but they do have ties to reality at the very least. And that's nice to know. Cars like this could very easily just be completely fictional, but they're not for the most part. Now this car, straight off the bat, I would say, is a flashier and more eye-catching machine. The Venturi is relatively understated as far as LM cars go. It's finished in a silver grey with not much of a body kit. It looks kind of like a more understated version of a Ferrari F40 in a similar way then to the road car, whereas this, it's bright white, it looks like a big Lamborghini Diablo race car on the track, it's got stickers all over the place, and it's just a more loud looking car. Now with that being said, I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. I actually do prefer the look of the Vector in the case of this one, although, funnily enough, for the road versions, I do prefer the Venturi 400 over the Vector M12. With the race cars, it's reversed, though. For me, I do prefer this Vector. In terms of numbers, though, the car doesn't do as well. It's not bad, but it's easily overshadowed by the Venturi, given that it has a lot less power, less torque, and it's a lot heavier. It weighs 1,160 kilos, which isn't bad, not by any means, but when the other car weighs less than a ton, it just makes this one look not that great. However, it's the same price, so is it worth buying, or is it worth as much consideration as the Venturi is? Well, of course, from person to person that will vary. For me, the lap times are actually surprisingly close. There's only about 0.2, 0.3 of a second between both cars, so that definitely shows that there is competition between them, but the Venturi was the quicker of the two. However, I will say I found the Vector to have better handling. It's a little bit heavier, at least with the settings that I was using, and a little bit smoother and less slippery. Again, the extra weight probably helps in that regard, but purely factually speaking, the Venturi was quicker. So, the final stage is, of course, to find out which one is better on paper. Well, first up, as always, we have, of course, the price. And as I already mentioned earlier on, both cars cost exactly the same. They are 2 million credits apiece, which means you could give neither of them the point, or in the case of the way I do things, let's just give them both a point just for the sake of it. As far as engine size, which of course is not always biggest is best, a rotary engine goes to prove that, but as I mentioned, we are doing this top trump style, because at the end of the day this is just for fun, so we'll give the biggest engine the point. Now, we're not told what the engine size of the Vector specifically is, but it is a V12 and it has similar numbers to what the road engine, also a V12, is capable of. So I believe it's more likely than not that it shares a version of that same essential engine, which is a 5.7 litre, so that's what we're going with. Either way, it is definitely a larger engine, though, than the Venturi. As far as power, though, the Venturi does easily have the win there. It's got a lot more power, although both of them are extremely powerful race cars. As far as torque, again, the Venturi has the advantage, which isn't too surprising given that it is turbo aspirated, whereas the Vector is naturally aspirated, and that can sometimes give a car that is turbocharged a torque advantage, especially when you're talking these kind of numbers. As far as weight, well, of course, it's an easy win for the Venturi. It weighs 200 kilos less, which is a massive margin, especially between cars that are supposedly in basically the same category in the game. And as far as horsepower per ton, well, of course, it's more powerful and it's lighter, so again, the Venturi gets an easy win. The problem with a match like this is that even though in terms of design and price and even lap time, they are very well matched, really, really well matched, closely matched, on paper, it really makes the Vector look bad, because although it is not a bad car at all in comparison in practice, it seems like a much, much less impressive vehicle than the Venturi does because of how amazing the numbers on the Venturi are, which is kind of a shame for the Vector. Overall, though, that does mean that, not too surprisingly, the Venturi is quite easily the winner, with 5 points to 2. And if you discount the equal point for price, that means that the Venturi has 4 points to its name, 4 unique ones, which are power, torque, weight, and horsepower per ton. A pretty crushing defeat there. And then the 1 point in favour of the Vector is the kind of irrelevant one of engine size. So overall, it is interesting to see just how one-sided the match becomes. The Venturi wins on paper and around the track, but I will once again stress that the Vector is not a bad car at all. It was only 0.2-ish of a second behind, and I would still hold to my statement that it was a better handling car. But overall, both of them are definitely highlights from Gran Turismo 2, and cars which I've always loved from that game. But overall, that's it for this particular Rivals match, and you can bet that we will most likely feature cars from Gran Turismo 2 again in the future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.